Hi, Krystal. Thanks so much for joining us on the Red Nation podcast. Can you start by introducing yourself?
Yes, a Pivawana, good morning. Mene Wos Dananehav. My name's Krystal Two Bulls. I'm Oglala, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and I am the director of the Land Back campaign for Indian Collective.
Great. I was wondering if you could just maybe start by giving a little bit of background about yourself as a military veteran and how that transformation took place from becoming a veteran or somebody who is an active service to an active war resistor.
Yeah, it's it's literally a lifelong journey and something I'm still coming into and still reconciling. But I think I enlisted in the military when I was 18 years old, and I think when you're 18 years old, you think you know everything. You think you have life figured out and all of that. And I was also coming out of an abusive relationship, and so I was craving like stability and structure and like financial stability. And the military got me because of all of that stuff, but also because I was raised by organizers in our community. Both my parents organize and have fought against coal mining and all of these things. And they always drilled into me to like serve my people and to be of service to my people. And so recruiters, they have it figured out and they know just what to say to get you. And they basically, they said serve your people and serve your country and serve your community. And I was also, in a weakened place of recovering from abuse and all of that. And it got me, and I thought that was the way I'm going to serve my people. That was the way I'm going to contribute to my community. And so I enlisted, and there were a couple key moments in my service where it really stood out to me that this is not the space for me. And that was when whenever I first enlisted and had to raise my right hand and swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, and my body like physically um started to like shake, and it was like this visceral response to my decision. But I just pushed it to the side and I kept going, and I enlisted. And then the second one was when when you go through basic training and then even when you deploy, you go through a series of vaccinations for all of the things, right? And and they vaccinated me for smallpox, and it was a really like traumatic moment of just like, oh my god, they're giving me smallpox. And like it hit me really hard, and it was a really difficult thing, and I tried to argue my way out of it. I tried to not get that, and I tried to explain why, and, no one listened. They didn't give a shit, it was just like, "You're just a cow
Mhm.
that has to walk through this line that" and get shots. And so that happened, and then the final thing that really did it was when I deployed to Kuwait in 2009 to 2010. I was in Kuwait, and I, um I would go and there's folks that work on the military installations, and they call them TCNs, and they're third country nationals. And so they aren't in the country that we're occupying, are from the country we're occupying, and they're not in the military, so they call them third country nationals. And I would go to our PX, our post exchange, and go visit with them. And because they were the only people of color that I felt like connected to. And after visiting with them, it really hit me that, I related more to them and connected more to them than my battle buddies, than the people I was actually serving with. And I felt, comfort with them. And when they shared their stories of why they were there working and why they were away from their families, I understood that because it's the same thing that we do for our families. And so just the connections and the of our cultures and our cultural norms and like why we do things was really powerful for me. But also the fact that I looked more like them, and I related more to them and felt a sense of comfort around them, um, was a huge eye opener. And so when I came home, I was already kind of on that track of like this, like I can't be career, because at one point in my military service, I thought I would go career, and I thought I would go in and become an officer and just make this my life. And when I left and I came home in 2010, I knew that wasn't the case, and I knew that my military service was done. It was just a matter of how I would be done. And then Winona LaDuke, she's good friends with my mom and dad. She came to our home, and she she brought her book, The Militarization of Indian Country. And she was like, Krystal, she's like, it's a little tough on, on the military, but I think you're gonna like this. And so I read it, and there was no going back after that. Like there was just no there was no way forward for the military and I. And she her book gave me a lot of language in ways to describe the internal conflict that I was going through, of being a veteran now, and an indigenous woman and a native woman. And that was something that I really struggle with and still struggle with to this day. And so once I read her book, that was it. And then I started down this long journey of just being done, which ultimately led to just me not showing up and just like being done. Like
Mm.
I refused to complete. But I was also just in the reserves. And so, rather than like fight with me to get me there, they just let me go. And then when my time was up, they just, pushed through the paperwork. And so, it ended up being okay. And then I went, I continued organizing. My family was organizers, most especially around environmental justice, a lot around like coal mining and extractive energy. And yeah, so I continued down this route, but I also attended this gathering with Climate Justice Alliance down in Black Mesa. And when I was there was a couple native like leaders and organizers there that had picked up on the fact that I was a veteran and wanted to send me through different trainings, because of the skill sets that I had already, and just like learn how to translate those. And that really was a moment where I never said I was a veteran in organizing spaces. Like I never used to say I was in the military, because I felt so much shame for being a part of that, the violence, and being a part of invading other indigenous lands, and then also acknowledging the violence and the genocide enacted on my own people by the military. And so I felt a lot of shame around it and never acknowledged that. And it I had to try to reconcile that, but I also like, part of the reconciliation process was really looking at like, I have skill sets. Like the military invested thousands of dollars into my training and my skills specifically, um, to make me what they wanted me to be. And I was a 92 Yankee, and so I started out as like just basic supply specialist. But when I deployed with Army Central Command at MACOM level, Major Command level, and so I ran logistics with a team, for a command, and so that was everything that fell within Iraq, Kuwait, Egypt, and Qatar. And so, the skill sets that come with that are, it feels like they don't make sense for organizing or direct action, but in reality, the way a lot of Indian country works is like through occupations, right? Like we occupy
Mm.
and do camps, and in running back end logistics for that, it was just a natural thing for me. And so I was just on that journey of really trying to like dive through all of that stuff. And then years later, Standing Rock happened, and I instinctually just found myself running logistics for camp, and just doing these things that I was like indoctrinated and trained to do and conditioned to do. I did them without it wasn't work. It just was like a second instinct for me to do. Um and so that was really empowering, and also like healing for me to find a way for these skill sets to be useful and to actually serve people, not an empire. And And then the final thing with like becoming like full blown anti-war, anti-militarism was I encountered the About Face Veterans Against War, and they were part of the veteran stand down that showed up at Standing Rock, but I didn't meet them there.
Mhm.
I met them after Standing Rock, and they were hosting a veterans action camp to do exactly what I was doing on my own, which is translating my military skill sets over to organizing and nonviolent direct action. And so they reached out to me, and then I offered to go as a trainer because I felt like I had already done all of that work in that process. And so I went as a trainer and helped around strategy development and action planning. And and from that point on, I felt at home because I was around other veterans who also felt shame, and other veterans who also had some of the like low level PTSD responses to things, and also other veterans who wanted a better world and who were really working towards collective liberation, and in that struggle to figure out what that means for us, and what does that mean for our identities as veterans and our identities in all the other spaces that we exist in. And so that's really what did it for me was all of those experiences, and obviously everything in between. But coming to About Face was what it gave me also the language to say like anti-war, to say anti-militarism, anti-imperialism, and to really see that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only veteran, although I am one of the few Native veterans that holds those ideologies and those beliefs. But I'm not the only veteran for sure. But yeah, that's kind of what took me on the journey from being a soldier over to actually serving my people.
This is a uneasy conversation in our communities because we do have such high rates of enlistment into the US military. And I think it's worth talking about because, it goes back into history, because the first indigenous people who were enlisted into, the service of the US military were often enlisted against their own people as scouts. And then later on, you had the militarization, and we think, and I think it's maybe worth taking a step back and actually talking about what we mean by the term militarization, because I think people think of it as just like, guns and occupations and weapons and, war, which it is in many ways, but it's also through the culture, like the militarization of indigenous culture, through a kind of veterans tradition. And I was wondering maybe if you could just like kind of break it down for people who may not understand this, like the kind of the tradition of military service within indigenous communities, and how you as an organizer maybe talk to communities about the militarization of Indian country.
Yeah, definitely. So we often at About Face we do trainings, and there's one training called the many-legged monster. And so like if you can envision and visualize almost like an octopus, right? And that octopus represents like the military industrial complex. And we go through this activity and really map out all of the different ways that the US military infiltrates our society, our culture, our communities, and then globally as well, right? And so we go through that. But what I always start with before we dive fully into that activity is I start with like kind of a historical context and almost like a history lesson and timeline, and really look at colonization and the fact that getting access to these lands and removing native peoples from the land was enforced by the US military, right? And so then to remove us, yeah, we weren't going to go easy. And so we fought back and we resisted, and we tried to fight off the encroachment, right? And where you see like the largest indigenous uprisings on this land during that time frame is where like interstates go through, right? Supply routes that were originally the supply routes for the US military during that time frame. Some of the largest military installations are in those areas as well. All of our not all, but a lot of our communities are named after the different forts that had existed there specifically to squash those uprisings and to squash that resistance that was there. And so, the US military is the enforcing mechanism of colonization, right? And so I always have to go back and really list out a full timeline of what that looked like. And then yeah, so I don't know. So I map those things out for people to start to understand that those those go together, the colonization and the militarization. And as you said, like the militarization isn't just like bombs and being at war and all of that. Like militarization is like the process of US military being normalized in our community. And I'm probably butchering this description, but it's just kind of how I understand it and grasp it. It's basically the normalization, right? In the process that
Mhm.
happens. And so you see that play out in like movies, right? So even like the entertainment industry makes millions of dollars, and the US military is contracted in to the entertainment industry to advise and consult on all of the movies that we see come out and play out. And all of those movies glorify the US military, right? Like we are never the bad guys in any of those movies, in any of those situations. In fact, it's the opposite of like where US veterans and military are as they're introduced as these like superhumans, right? And so then it becomes normalized and it perpetuates this thing that we call like the veteran mystique. Where
Mhm.
veterans are like superhumans and soldiers are superhumans. And like, if shit's going down, then just call in one veteran and everything will be taken care of. As in like Rambo, like so all of these movies are like perpetuating
Who
that,
himself is like supposed to be indigenous, right?
right? Yeah. And so like that is so prevalent in like video games. Like the US military contracts in and also consults and advises on video games. Also, a lot of the video games and what is being created and produced are like the feedback is given to the US military, right? To
Mhm.
inform our planning and our tactics and strategy. And so that's part of it as well. Even it goes as far as I actually just recently discovered this. There was a Netflix series last summer that had came out, and it was about the murder of this young child who was in the foster care system. And I found out through that Netflix series that the war profiteers, so groups like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, um, actually get contracts from the US government to run our social services and to run foster care. And so
Mhm.
the military industrial complex even goes as far as doing the human resource work that our country has, right? And that it needs. And so it's basically turning our social services and our human resources into a corporation and into war profiting, right? And profiting off of that. And so I don't know, there's just so many different ways that the military and militarism infiltrate our daily lives, right? Even right down to the clothing that we wear, the camo, um, all of it. And it's crazy to think about that, but all of those things, like the even the holidays that we have, like Veterans Day, today,
Mhm.
right, is really to honor the sacrifice that veterans made for this country to be free and all of that. And it's so funny because I'm like, free from who?
Mhm.
Like who are like the reality is like we are the strongest US military power in this world, right? And so it's
Mhm.
like who are we really fighting for freedom from, right? And so it's we our country is so conditioned though, and it is so mainstream and normalized for veterans to be uplifted as superhuman beings and to perpetuate that veteran mystique that we don't even ask the questions, we don't even like dive deeper into those things, and then the culture itself reinforces that and then just conditions us to not ask questions and to continue to just like accept that that's just the way it is. Thank a veteran, shake their hand, thank them for their service, all of those things. And so that's the process, and it's rooted and it's grounded in the removal of indigenous peoples from their land. I mean,
Mhm.
it started there, and then that process is what was like the template, right? So like the removal of us from our lands, U.S. military being the enforcing mechanism, like that's kind of like the baseline template for what we see now as like U.S. imperialism. So the U.S. empire can get access to other indigenous lands overseas. They send in the U.S. military as under the guise of like aid or support, or like relationship building, or in the name of democracy, or whatever it might be, whatever excuse we're using at the time. But the reality is that that's still a colonial process, and now an imperial process, right? Of building out the U.S. empire so that we can have strategic points and advantages for our military to get access to those lands and those resources freely, without any resistance. And so, yeah, like all of it goes all the way back to Indigenous people, and I always present it in that way, and then and then dive into the activities and pointing out like how truly interwoven the US military is to our everyday lives and to everything that we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, right down to social services in the foster care system, in the movies, in the toys that our children play with, the little toy soldiers. Like those are so normalized, is that you go to war, like that's the thing.
Mhm.
um, and it's really disgusting to be
Yeah.
honest, to see how interwoven into our community and our culture it is. But yeah, that's kind of how I talk about it and view it, even though there's so many more things in there, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the idea of the Indian Wars is incredibly important because they never really ended, and it's not just that the Indian Wars evolved into kind of this planetary enterprise of U.S. Global dominance, but it's also like the kind of domestic counterinsurgency that's run against indigenous people, and I believe that the militarization of indigenous people, like as subjects of empire, was an incredibly important process, and it's not some kind of conspiracy, and it exists within the archival evidence. As as somebody who's a historian, I found many instances in which the United States government, as active Indian policy, you know, put out circulars within the Indian Affairs. Here's one of them that was in 1889 or 1889, around the same time as the so-called civilization regulations that outlawed, dancing, indigenous ceremonies, or any kind of like indigenous like familial relation that kind of contravened or went against kind of like Christian white Christian values. And this one in 1889 was called the Inculcation of Patriotism in Indian schools, and it talks about teaching children English, and indigenous children English, by first teaching them, the founding fathers and the
Mm,
words to the Star Spangled Banner, and then also pledging allegiance to the flag. And it's important to remember that the Pledge of Allegiance didn't exist at this time, but it was
mm,
very much experimented as like some as a way to inculcate young people within indigenous communities. And I think the other important aspect of this, and I've written about it quite extensively, is that boarding schools were actually an extension of the U.S. Indian Wars. They were actually seen as a military project. It was one of the few, or one of the first instances in which the Department of Interior worked hand in hand with the U.S. military to create institutions to basically indoctrinate indigenous people. And Carlisle, Indian school actually came from Pratt, who was a military veteran. He's a
mhm,
military veteran of the Civil War, and then later the Indian Wars, and he actually served under Custer himself. And he saw the U.S. military as the great kind of civilizing influence on the West, not simply because it was conquering lands, but it was the only institution of the U.S. government that actually mixed indigenous people, freed African Americans, and whites on the frontier. Of course, all the white people were the commanders And so he took that idea in a prisoner of war camp that was in Fort Marion, Florida, in the 1870s, and basically instilled military discipline in these chiefs. They were Comanche Utes who were captured, Kiowas who were captured. Some of them were Apaches, and he dressed them in military uniforms, taught them military drills, and eventually that prisoner of war camp, there were no U.S. Military guards anymore, because the prisoners themselves became the guards and became
Mhm.
the enforcers of order and discipline and white civilization. He took that model of removing indigenous people from their own societies and militarizing them into basically what was like a military, like a military barracks, a training ground, and imported or exported it to the Carlisle Industrial School, which was actually built on the United States oldest military installation, which today is actually a functioning military base for the U.S. Army. And that's where they took those children and put them into that school, and basically indoctrinated them into military discipline. They didn't learn anything. The majority of students died there. More students died at Carlisle than they actually graduated in its first years. But later on, as it kind of continued, we know, like, Jim Thorpe and the kind of the athletics program and the creation of modern U.S. football. But what we don't know is that a lot of those children, were sons and daughters of uh, leadership in these communities, and they were taken for specific reason to basically hold them as hostage, to get those leaders to sign over land. And later on, as World War One, as the United States entered World War One, a lot of these children matriculated. Some of them weren't even 18. Some of them were like 16 years old. They matriculated from Carlisle Industrial School and other off-reservation schools directly into the military, because they had already basically undergone basic training
Mhm.
and military discipline. And so I think that's an important historical aspect to think about. These were not even citizens of the United States, but the citizenship process, was through an intense form of military indoctrination.
Yeah, yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I remember when you first told me about those or about that. And that was something that I was like, man, that just makes so much sense. Like, and especially for me with like land back campaign, right? Is like it
Mm-hmm.
made so much sense that this has always been about the relationship to the land, right? And the stewardship and our ability to like fulfill like these original instructions that were given to us, right, to like steward this land. um it's always been about that, right? And so it's always been about removing us from the land, disconnecting us from the land. um and then we've always constantly been in this state of trying to reclaim that, right, and to defend the land and protect the land, and reclaim the relationship to it. And that's just further evidence of that, right? Is like I recall you mentioning that of the enlistment rate going up because there was this promise of leaders being able to
Mm-hmm.
reclaim land and be given land back if their children enlisted, right, and their sons. And so that really stuck with me. And it, yeah, like Carlisle boarding school and General Pratt and like all of those are just like deeper roots of militarism in this country, right? In I don't know, even just looking at like the fact that like Carlisle after they closed it down as the boarding school, it's now the US Army War College. So
Yeah.
it's a war college. And like I don't know, it
They're
just blows
training they're
my
training officers for the US war on terror. Like, that's what they're
yeah,
doing. I went there. I actually went there, and you have to go through
security.
this like background check, like before
Yep.
you can even enter the campus. And there's all those graves of all the children who died at the school, like at
Yep.
the back entrance. And it's
Yep.
it's it's kind of horrific in many ways.
Mhm. It is. I was there as well. Like it was right before Standing Rock popped off. We were on our way to Philadelphia for the DNC, and just all of all of the doings around that. And we were on our way home from that, and we stopped in there, and it was horrific looking at it, and just being on that land was really just like heartbreaking. Yeah, and so just looking at that, like the way the military was, even just like right now is such a significant time in Indian country as well. Like it's, perceived as this time of going into the holiday season and blah blah blah. But for us, like it's really going into a deep season of trauma. Um
Mm,
and just looking at in the wintertime, like our nomadic folks, plains relatives, like this is the time where we found winter camp and where we shared our
mm,
stories, and we were together as a village and as families, and we were more in like a dormant type state, right? And these are the times when we were actually at our most vulnerable because we weren't moving constantly, right, with the herds. We were actually in one place, and that made it easier for us to be attacked by the US military. And that was like a strategic decision, knowing that we would be in one location, right? And those are the moments when we were attacked. And this is when you see all of the massacres that happened all across Indian country. In this season, very specifically, is that time. Um, just like named like the Fort Robinson outbreak, when my people, the Northern Cheyenne, journeyed back from being taken to Oklahoma to Indian territory, and we made a decision to come home or die trying. And we were
mm,
captured on the way home at Fort Robinson and starved into submission, right? But we still didn't do it. And they tried to starve us and freeze us out. But they did it, they broke out of the barracks that they were being held in, and only a small handful made it home to our lands here in Powder River territory in southeastern Montana. And like then we have like the Wounded Knee massacre. We have the
mm,
Sand Creek massacre down just south of Denver, in Baker's massacre for the Blackfeet people. Like massacres, just all the Dakota 38 hanging, right? And like
mm,
on Christmas. And so it's just like all of these supposed holiday season and holidays, like they represent trauma for us. And it's an intentional rewriting of history by saying that this is like a holiday season, right? Like, oh, Thanksgiving. Like it wasn't this like brutal massacre. It wasn't this, horrific colonization and attempted genocide. It was, oh, it was a meal that we shared together, and all of the BS that's put out with that. Or Christmas being this like holiday of like giving and like being with family and all of that. But the reality is for us, like that's just an intentional erasure of like what our people had gone through, right? And
mm,
it just covers over the top of what we experienced. And so I think we're definitely in a time of reckoning with that, and really being able to like name those things and to say like, no, that's an intentional erasure, and then the rewriting of a narrative that upholds white supremacy in this country, right? um
right.
yeah, and so
Yeah, I
just like,
think that.
go ahead.
Oh, go
No,
ahead.
no, no, I was just gonna say, and even just adding on, like the fact that like the we fell up underneath the Department of Defense, right? Like the Indian
Right.
problem was under the Department of Defense
It was
first.
actually called the Department of the War, a Department of
Or
War at the time.
yeah, exactly. And then over time, we got moved over to the Department of Interior with our land and with
With buffalo and
yeah,
natural resources.
yeah, it's just crazy.
Well, I think like, the would always, like, and you're right, like this is a season, of intense kind of grief and trauma. And it's also important to remember that the United States government and the military itself, led these campaigns against indigenous people, not just because they had some kind of like, just or ahistorical like hatred of native people. It was about the land, yes, but it was also about the alternative world that indigenous people, the alternative political order that indigenous people represented. And I think that's encapsulated in the Dakota uprising on one hand, but then also I think more importantly with the ghost dance on the other hand, uh, because the ghost dance, speaking of land back, to my mind, was actually a land back campaign. It was an articulation of indigenous, not just like indigenous cultural revitalization. It wasn't really a cultural revitalization, because it was a new thing. It was a new cultural phenomenon. It was a new social phenomenon. And it was in direct protest to the imposed reservation order that disallowed dancing,
Mhm.
fundamentally as a as a kind of illegal act. And so the act of dancing itself was criminal. But it wasn't like necessarily like quote unquote militant. There were like armed ghost dancers, right? But at the
Mhm.
same time, they were defying the orders of the day. And if you go back, and I always encourage people to do this, it's like it's really sad that we only know the massacre and we don't know the vision, right,
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
what they were dancing for, because what they were dancing for and what they were envisioning is something that's incredibly beautiful. And they had their horses, slaughtered at the time, so they lost that relative, that connection with those relatives. Most of them were starving. Most of them were unarmed, and so you have what could ostensibly, by today's standards, if it's applicable, a nonviolent, like protest movement that has
Mhm.
swept most Indian reservations in the West, and the United States government deploying half of its standing army against starving, unarmed, horseless people, right?
Mhm.
That they didn't just do that because they hate Indians. They did it because they understood the potency of that particular vision. And when I was reading your op-ed, as as preparing for this interview, and one thing that sticks out to my mind is that that vision today lives on in things like Standing Rock, right?
Mhm.
Why
Mhm.
did 90 different law enforcement jurisdictions get deployed to this backwater, place? Nothing against being backwater. Like I'm from the country, I know that, but but like all of these like law enforcement jurisdictions get deployed, 90 different law enforcement jurisdictions, the National Guard, the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Patrol, all of them were deployed to one of the poorest places in the Western Hemisphere, right? Which is like Sioux County, which is also known as the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, to
Mhm.
deploy against an unarmed prayer movement, right?
Mhm. Yeah. I think that's always been the case. So like when I think about like the land back movement and then land back campaign is like I always say that. Like I always start by saying like we're just stepping into this long legacy of work because the reality
Mm,
is we've always envisioned that. We've always been working towards reclaiming our relationship to the land. We've always protected it and we've always done it in whatever way that we could, whatever ways were available to us. And even if that meant being part of our tool of the US empire, right? And enlisting in the military. Like our intentions are always that. Like we are the original stewards of this land, you know? And everything is centered on that. Like our ceremonies, our languages, our songs, everything is like rooted in our land. And in fact, like, we have songs here with Northern Cheyenne that tell us like we are the land. Um, and so it's just like holding true to that, like it's land back campaign has always existed ever since the first settler hit this land, right? And so it's just like thinking about that is I really appreciate you saying like we focus on the massacre, we focus on those things that happened, and we forget oftentimes that we've our ancestors envisioned us reclaiming land, like, and that's
mhm.
what most often they died for, right? Is that same struggle and that fight to be able to reclaim that. And stepping into that is just it's humbling, right? And it's also really powerful and really guided. And like I think that we it's true, we do focus on the massacre and we spend so much of our time memorializing those sacrifices, right? And on honoring those sacrifices, which we should continue doing. Like I not saying we shouldn't do that. And also we should be spending just as much time, like you said, like visioning towards like what does that actually look like when we reclaim our lands. And there are examples of successes, right? There are those different pockets across the country where native folks have reclaimed land stewardship and where they have been able to
Mhm.
reconnect And so it's like I want us to move into a place where we shift more towards that, and we really put our energy in our prayers, in our organizing, and our efforts towards that vision, right? And towards uplifting and supporting those, and so that way we continue to struggle, we continue to fight, we continue to defend, right? Like that is a given. And we're also building and creating this world that we know is possible, that we know that our ancestors died for. Yeah, and so I think, yeah, just looking at that is like it's always been about that. It's always been about this, like this fight between our fight over the land, of like us being in relationship to the land, and you know others wanting access
Mhm.
to the land and the resources and to exploit it, right? And then it's always been enforced by the US military. That has always been at play. And yeah, I don't know, like it's just interesting to see that. Is like the US military being deployed on US soil is just a ridiculous concept. But every major movement that has gained any kind of traction in this country and on this land has had the US military deployed to squash it, right? And so it's like
Right.
we see that, and you see it most especially in the Indian country. Like, I mean,
And
how
it's
many
been
different,
deployed against you personally as well
yeah,
at the
specifically,
July
yes.
3rd action.
Yeah. I mean, and those are just like naming a couple, right? And like that's not even looking like Wounded Knee, right? Like the occupation of
Mhm.
Wounded Knee, they were deployed. All these different movements, Oka, like all of them. And so it's just like looking at that history is like we've always stood for that. We've always been in this fight for land back. And we've always been in relationship to the land. And I think that we're just in a moment of that being like more normalized, and it's exciting, right? It's, I don't know, for me it's exciting.
Well, yeah, if you even look back at like the wounded, or excuse me, the ghost dance, you had people like Crow Dog, who was an Indian scout, and it was part of the Indian police, like part of the occupation force, who like flipped and became a resistance leader, right?
Hmm.
And even during the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973, Pedro Bissonnet was a Vietnam veteran, and many of the people who'd had arms training and knew how to like create bunkers and things like that, um, were military veterans, native people who were military veterans. Many of the people who ran security in Standing Rock were veterans, and you had a large veterans contingent. And I really love the terms like land defender and water protector, because to me it turns what you said earlier, that impulse of indigenous people to serve their people, or to serve my people, into one that is beneficial to everyone. But it's, to use the phrase of your organization, but to drop the military industrial complex part of
Yep.
it, right?
Yep.
And thinking about where we're going in 2021 and beyond, with an ostensibly different administration that may or may not take a different direction when it comes to climate policy, and especially when we think about the campaigns that you're working on with land back through Indian Collective. I think about the U.S. military as not only the number one purveyor of violence throughout the world, but also as as the world's largest institutional consumer of oil,
Yep.
and the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, like more so than most countries, right? And so when we talk about just the demilitarization of Indian country, it's also like a climate justice policy as well.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah, we there's so many pieces to that. You just look at like most of the oh God, what are they called? The Superfund sites that exist within the
Hmm.
United States are on military land, like military owned land, right? Are military installations. You go over to like Afghanistan and Iraq, and we left burn pits that produce so much toxic air. It just were completely toxic, that we don't even know what the health impacts were on the peoples there on those lands. Just even looking at the impacts here, it's mind blowing to look at that, how that is just like it's okay because it's the military and they're fighting for freedom, right? So it's like the fact that we are the biggest polluter, are the largest polluter in the world, and that we are the largest consumer in the world as well is just like, it's mind blowing because it's all justified and it's all minimized by simply saying like, but we're fighting for freedom, right?
Mm.
And it's that again is enforced by that, enforced by the culture and like the veteran mystique. But it's just interesting. You had brought up earlier about how it in all of these resistance camps and the organizing happening and all of that, like it was primarily veterans, right, that were there providing like weapons training, and that were able to like run security and have security teams and train and do all of those things. I think that to me, those are the pieces that I hold on to as a veteran. And that is actually the key part that helped me um, start to heal and to really reconcile like these different identities that I have within myself. And that is really where, we look at like like Native people enlist at the highest rate per capita than any other group, right? And that means for us that sometimes in our communities, we have over 50% veterans in our
Mm.
communities. And that is mind blowing to look at. Actually, it might be 40%, 50% is a lot, but that's mind blowing to think about though, like the veterans that we have in our communities. And to me, if we are able to like politicize them, to mobilize them, and to deploy them into organizing spaces, into communities that need support, like we are the most underutilized groups in our communities when it comes to resistance and when it comes to organizing and when it comes to um, being able to protect, right? And I don't know. So to me, like, I can't even, like, I get really excited thinking about the idea of like politicizing veterans and then training them, translating our skill sets over, and then mobilizing, right? Like we see how successful it could be whenever we have things like the Vets Wall in Portland, when we have things
Mm.
like the veteran contingent that deployed to Standing Rock. So it's like it's very possible for us to use these skill sets in ways that actually truly serve the people, right? And we have
Mm.
to, and that's one thing that I loved about working with About Face is that that's what we were doing. We were truly invested in that. And even now in this current moment that we are in with the election defenders and the Joy to the Polls and all of the organizing that happened across the country with the Frontline campaign, is that About Face was like a key leader in that campaign. And we had veterans across the country that are part of our network that were on the ground providing training and translating their skill sets and providing protection for folks that were going to the polls to vote. Um, and so just looking at that and how key of a role that veterans played in that, protecting our right to vote right now, it's mind blowing. And I think that it we're we don't even have as many veterans as we would like to have, right? Like as far as our network goes. And so once we can get more veterans moving in that direction and politicized and translating skill sets and like that's like mainstream. But can you imagine what it would look like if in our own communities that our veterans were able to truly serve and they were able to do that in defense of the land and reclaiming stewardship of the land. Like to me it just, yeah, I don't even know, I can't even like imagine like what is truly possible if we do that, right? um
Mm.
and so it's like looking at even just like moving forward, like looking at, unfortunately, like enlistment into the military because of like the systemic oppression, right? In the environments that we live in, and all of the symptoms of oppression that we have to live with on a daily basis, like addiction and violence and abuse, all of those things that unfortunately we have, higher rates of in our communities. Um, like enlisting in the military is the only option sometimes for our young people to really get away from addiction, get away from an early death, or get away from prison or those things. And it's perceived that way, right? Because I think that there's a different reality available to us, but it's perceived as that is the only route to go forward, right? And so
Mm.
unfortunately now, like it's a difficult position for me to be in because I'm a veteran and I am anti-war and anti-militarism, and I feel the daily impacts of the US military on my body, on myself, on my spirit, and my emotional and behavioral well-being, right? And and also I cannot tell a young person in my community to not enlist because sometimes I know that young person's full story, and like at the moment I don't see another way forward. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
so our people are like forced into these positions where like that's not a choice. Like that's not a choice at all. Like that young person's choice was taken from them by this system. Um and so they do that. But and so like I envision a future of like what does it look like whenever we reclaim our young people and we reclaim our ability to train warriors, right, to serve our people, and we have our own internal ways of creating that warrior role again in our communities without the US military, right? And so like I really I want to envision that world and work towards that world. And in the meantime, with veterans that do have those skill sets and that are trained in that, we can offer our skills and translate them and offer our experience, to start that, right? And to serve in these different movement spaces and to, yeah, to actually serve in a real way and not to just be a tool of an empire. And so I have a lot of hope in that. And in also holding that hope is very healing for me as well, in reconciling like being a soldier who simply follows orders, um, back to being a warrior, right? That does what is necessary for the well-being of my people, my community, the land, and all of our plant and animal relatives, right? So I have a
Hmm.
lot of hope in that.
Well, I think that, there is evidence to show that there is an alternative other than the U.S. military. And I would say, during Standing Rock, I heard statistics from people, and this is like anecdotal, who worked in suicide prevention, is that young people, during the Standing Rock occupations, the rates of suicide in Indian reservations within South Dakota had actually dropped,
Mm,
and they attributed it to basically the psychological, you know, immeasurable impact of the uprising itself, and the fact that,
mhm,
like, all of these programs, that address, I call it programitis. You have all these programs to prevent suicides, which is, it's important work, and I'm not trying to like diminish it, but it doesn't often go at the root cause of, like, of colonization, but then also not just like looking at the problem, but offering an alternative. And I see the identity of a water protector, of a land defender, treaty defender, as, an alternative, like, political and social identity, not only for just indigenous people, but for everyone. It gives people a sense of purpose. And if you think about the allocation of, the green transition funds that are coming from the federal government, the United States military is sucking up a lot of that, those resources. I think Biden has pledged like $2 trillion to a green energy economy. There's already speculation that a lot of that's already earmarked for the US military itself, the number one polluter. And I think
yep.
about this in terms of indigenous communities, because indigenous communities are already working green jobs, right? By defending land and water and air that we all need to survive.
Mm,
Indigenous communities defend 80% of the world's biological diversity, as well as still controlling about 1/4 of the world's, landmass. And in those regions where indigenous people manage and steward the land, it's not that they don't, that they don't like grow food or exploit it for its resources. It's done in a different way, obviously, but the impacts are vastly different than, other places where there is kind of capitalist development. And so it's not just a kind of shift in thinking within indigenous communities towards, away from the military industrial complex, and to the politics and the values of water protection and land defense, but it's also a shift in values, for, the people who live on this land together. And I think that it's important it's an important political social identity to inhabit, and that should be privileged, not just within indigenous communities but also outside of them, because we are going to need a disciplined kind of rank and file people who are willing to, push and defend the land, as as it becomes increasingly under threat and under attack. And I see that as something that's an extension of not just the land back campaign that Indian Collective is doing, but like the larger land back campaign that everyone is doing. You have homeless tent cities set up in Philadelphia that are run by Black organizers, right? That are
Yep.
challenging housing policies that have kicked people out of their housing or evicted them during a global pandemic. And you have a similar thing happening in Mini Luzahan camp in Rapid City.
Yep.
And I think it's the beginning of something. It's not necessarily the end of, like we all just have to become water protectors, but it's like the beginning of something. And I think, in many ways, Standing Rock really kind of opened that door. And I think it says something morally. It's a moral indictment against this country
Hmm.
when those people who have taken, those vows as U.S. veterans and those pledges are beginning to, turn against the very direction that this country is taking. And I remember at Standing Rock, it was Leonard Crow Dog. He rolled out in his wheelchair, and he was surrounded by all of these people. Some of them were military veterans, and he just straight up told them. He said, by standing with us right now, he's like, you're doing an important thing. He's like, but just remember that you have now become a traitor of the United States government, and they're going to treat you that way. He's like, you're going to be, now you're going to be treated like an Indian. And he's like, whether or not you stay with us is contingent upon, the vows that you took here to protect the land and the water. And I thought that was really important. Like and he wasn't the only one who said that. A lot of those elders made similar kind of statements and sentiments. But I thought it was just like a really powerful moment, because you saw all the white people and non-native people, like their eyes just got really big when they realized what was happening. But that's really, in many ways, that's really what is at stake. It's like, by positioning yourself as a land defender or as a water protector, you're taking a certain stand against not just the environmental policies of a country, but its entire history of bloody, like genocidal, like militarism.
Hmm.
And it's something that we are now kind of seeing happen. We saw it a little bit under Trump, but I think as things aren't going to get better, as things get worse, we're going to be seeing more of that intensified and sharpening. And it's not like I'm not advocating for violence by any means, but I'm saying it's like I think it is the more peaceful and just alternative to the war that people are pushing for right now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I 100% agree, and definitely appreciate that as land defenders and water protectors being like this like identity. I I wholeheartedly agree. It's interesting that, yeah, like even you naming like Camp Mini Luzaha and these different spaces, because like when with Camp Mini Luzaha, there's a lot of veterans there.
Hmm.
I've been going back and forth and making supply runs from Montana to camp, and there's a lot of veterans there. And when we did the Land Back campaign launch on Indigenous Peoples Day, we had a bunch of land back flags, and we put them on poles, and we pulled up and down at the band shell in Memorial Park, and all of the veterans grabbed those flags and stood at parade rest with the flags.
Hmm.
And I walked up, and it just like it hit me really hard, and I broke down and like started crying, because it was just like they need a purpose, right? um and unfortunately, like when they enlisted in the military, they thought they had found that purpose, and and then it was taken from them when they left, and then per the military usual is they were just thrown to the side, right? Without benefit, without support, without transition, any of that stuff, just like tossed to the side. Thank you for your service, right? And so for me, it was just a really clear moment of like I need to maintain that. I need to continue to hold this space for veterans specifically within the Land Back campaign as much as I'm able to, right? Just for the simple fact that like we have access to knowledge and skills and experience there. And also, we do this work, obviously to reclaim stewardship of land, but because of all the things that were taken from us in the trauma that happened when we were removed from the land, right? And
Mm.
and so for me, like we need healing within this group, like within veterans, and for to be able to claim that identity as a land defender and a water protector as a veteran, it gives us a newfound purpose. And I believe that through that purpose we find healing. And the more we heal, the more purpose that we feel. And we're able to like to do this work and heal simultaneously when we do that, right? And so I see it happening at Camp Miniliuzaha. I see it happening in different places. And it's funny, like bringing veterans together is like such a big thing right now, because not right now, but it always has been. But like even just like the history of the anti-war movement, right? Like during
Right.
Vietnam and all of that, but also looking at like the bonus army. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but like the bonus army was like all of these veterans that were promised these bonuses, this amount of money for their service, and they didn't receive it when they got home. And so there was a lot of organizing happen, and thousands marched on DC and just moved there because they were homeless, and they weren't being provided for. They had no health care. They had no employment. They were dealing with PTSD. They were dealing with all of these things, and they were not being supported by the U.S. military or by the U.S. government. And so then the bonus army marched on DC and occupied that space. And during that time frame was also like Black Panthers, Brown Berets, AIM, like all of these movements, right? But the one movement that I wouldn't say like feared the most, maybe, but like that they really needed to like to basically get rid of was the military, the veterans, because of our political capital, because of our skill sets, and because of our ability, what we are capable of when we actually organize together against the US government. um, they were scared of that. And so,
Mhm.
it ended up being they just like paid them off, and like I think they actually called the US military in on those veterans, and they attacked that camp. And then a lot of them stayed and they continued to occupy. And then what ended up happening is they finally got some sort of payment, after that. But it's really ironic that like, the US military was called in on veterans in this country,
Mhm.
right? And that is our past as veterans. Like that is what they come from. And like during that, the anti-war movement was very radical and very organized, right? And I think that merging these identities of like land defender and water protector and indigenous folks protecting the land, and veterans, like those of us that hold both of those identities, like we're in a unique space of being able to bring all of that together, right? And to me, that is power, and that also is like hope for how we move forward together. One other piece that you brought up too was like the budget. Like, man, it's ridiculous. Like
Right.
our you know, budgets are like reflections of values, right? Like even as individuals, where we spend our money is really a reflection of what we value in our lives, right? In the US budget is no different from that. It is a reflection of our values. And right now, our values very much reflect war and violence and genocide and occupation. And so it's like we have to be able to look at that and acknowledge that that is what our values say about all of us, right? And yeah, so it's just like even with the land back campaign, like one of our demands is like defund the mic, the military industrial complex. And where we say that because that directly impacts us. Like you mentioned earlier, the lack of like housing, healthcare, and education, all of these things that we so desperately need in our communities are underfunded because all of that money gets funneled into the defense budget. And that opens the door for us to just continuously be at war. um I don't know. So it's just interesting, all of these dynamics and the way that it plays out and like has direct impacts on our communities. But the budget is a huge one that reflects our values. And like, I do challenge veterans, especially Native veterans, to acknowledge these things. And it's hard. And it's it doesn't feel good all the time. But I feel like if we're going to be acknowledged as warriors in our community and we're going to be honored in our communities for our service, then I feel like when we are out of government service, we need to continue to serve our communities, and we need to continue that. I don't think that like warrior is this title that like you do service with the US military and you earn that, which yes, that is true. I can get on board with that, but also you need to continue to like earn that. You need to continue to like serve the community and protect and yeah, like I don't know, I feel like I challenge people to really push beyond only serving in the US military, but to start truly serving in our communities where it's desperately needed right now. And translating those skill sets and those experiences and that knowledge that we have. Um, because who knows what is possible when we do that. And yeah, so I don't know, I really push on Native veterans, and it's it's hard to do that. And in our communities where acknowledging them as warriors is so deeply embedded and rooted, right?
Yeah, I think it's, as we kind of wrap this up, it's important to remember that, the endless US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have claimed, upwards to 1 million people in those countries, with over 21 million people displaced. And there is a direct impact, a toll that this kind of belligerence on the rest of the world has created. And as we approach like 200 or a quarter million dead from coronavirus, it's like there are real casualties, to this kind of belligerence and
Yep.
lack of, carelessness towards human life. And I think it's just really important to put that into perspective for people, that this isn't just about um, veterans and their issues, but it's also about the fact that the U.S. military has perpetrated genocidal violence on entire nations of people, and there's a huge historical debt that this country owes not only to Indigenous people, but to the rest of the world, for basically holding the future of the world hostage.
Yep.
And I think some of the things that you've laid out are pathways that we can begin to hold ourselves accountable as people who live within the belly of the beast, as well as thinking about alternatives to military service. And yeah, so with that, I guess, where can people find your work, and what's the best way that they can support it?
Yeah, so right now I'm the director of the Land Back campaign with Indian Collective. So, indiancollective.org and landback.org are two ways, to get involved with what I'm currently doing. And then veteran specific stuff, you can always hook up with About Face, Veterans Against War, or Veterans for Peace. Both of those two veteran specific spaces are spaces that I've existed in and truly believe in. And so, either one of those spaces, Land Back campaign will always hold a space for veterans. We'll continue to bring that narrative into the work that we do with Land Back in the land, knowing that those two things are connected. And yeah, so About Face, Veterans Against War, Veterans for Peace, or landback.org and indiancollective.org is where you can find most of my organizing right now.